the glow of the election season is off for me. With Bernie Sanders out of the race and his somewhat tragic, downtrodden, Eeyore-like capitulation to Hillary Clinton, being forced by the Democrat Party to endorse her because they've shown such bad judgment in backing her, and now they've backed a dirty horse, and they have to put her in no matter what. And so the rest of us be damned. And I fear for the future of this country. I do not think that anything good is coming. I think that she's a total crook and a total fraud. She is not representing women. She does not, she's playing to the women's vote, but that does not mean that she's empowering to us at all. But today we're going to turn our eyes back across the seas with Tony Gosling, who is a former BBC journalist and tremendous blogger and continues to be one of the leading independent journalists of Britain. I have tremendous respect for you, Tony. And we're going to talk today about the Chilcot Report. The Chilcot Report has just been released, damning British pre-war intelligence and stopping short, however, of recommending that Tony Blair should face criminal prosecution for war crimes, but definitely far superior to anything we've seen in the United States so far with the whitewashes that have been done here. Thank you, Tony, for joining us.
Hi, Susan. Thanks very much for inviting me again.
Well, I really felt that you would have the best the best insight to explaining the Chilcot Report to us. Tell everybody how this came about.
Well, it was Gordon Brown that's got it started. There was something called the Butler Report just a couple of years after the Iraq invasion, which didn't really. Britain has this, as I'm sure the United States has the same thing. The way of institutional cover-ups and establishment cover-ups, which are based around the idea of, we're going to really look deeply into this. And then what they do is they appoint an establishment person, as Chilcot is and as Butler was, to, I suppose, really to get some of the confidential documents out to the public, but then to allow those who were involved in the crimes of the Iraq War to have a look first, so that they can tone down or tweak anything that might be evidence against them. And let's not forget that actually a few years ago over in Malaysia, the president instituted a war crimes trial in Malaysia against Bush and Blair for the Iraq. And a lot of people seem to forget this. Certainly the entire London media have completely ignored the fact that if Tony Blair or George Bush or Dick Cheney, or in fact some of the Israeli war criminals set foot in Malaysia, they're liable to be arrested on the spot. So what's happened here is we've had an exercise really for the media.
I was very proud of Malaysia for leading that charge, yes. They set the standard. They truly showed the integrity of their systems, of their values. One of the things we forget is that this is an ex-British colony, yeah? And so it's got a kind of connection with the British. A lot, I would say for Americans, if they've never visited Malaysia, a lot of people there speak English very well. And there's a kind of, like there is in some parts of India, a kind of fondness for the British way of doing things, because it's quite certain, and some of my family were involved in colonial affairs many years ago, that there was a very strong sense of fair play amongst some of the colonists. Now, I know, to begin with, when any place is colonized, you get a kind of fascistic, evil class that go in and do the colonizing in the first place. But that wasn't necessarily the case for the administrators of some of the colonies. And I don't want to defend the whole colonialist thing at all, but I think you've got a very different form of colonialism now with the US than you had with the British, because the British wanted to make sure that there was at least some degree of fair play. And I think that actually did happen in Malaysia, or what was at the time called Malaya and Singapore. And so in Singapore and Malaya,
there is this quite, fondness for the British in years gone by. And I found that just talking to Singapore's and Malays, it's not just, the sort of unadulterated hatred, but they've done a fantastic job. And I think it may well be that the takedown of the Malaysian airliners had something to do with the fact that they are really one of the only countries on the planet that's taken the whole Nuremberg principle seriously, Susan.
Oh, I think that's true. I thought that from the very beginning, that the takedown of Malaysia Airlines had something to do with that, and I'm convinced that it was not the Arabs who did it. It was a real false flag, like a warning to the Malaysians.
Well, the two airliners, there was MH370, which so-called disappeared. And I mean, we don't want to get too deep into this, but I did work in aviation for many years, and so I've written, I think, a couple on the RT website of pretty good articles on both of those. And it's quite clear that the first airliner that disappeared, that was flying from Kuala Lumpur over to Beijing, that so-called disappeared. Once the military radar traces were released by the Malaysians, we then it was quite clear that the aircraft hadn't disappeared at all. It had backtracked and zoomed off across the north of the Indian Ocean. So that, was just a lie, basically, we'd been told. Then there were sightings of it in the Maldives. Early in the morning, the night after the night it disappeared, and whether it was hacked or whether the pilot was told by the military to fly it in a certain direction and did, looks to me as if that one ended up down at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. Then there was just after the Maidan coup in Ukraine, in Kiev, there was the downing of MH17, which was flying from Amsterdam all the way over to Kuala Lumpur to Malaysia. And there is an extraordinarily brilliant documentary. I think it's Russia Today that's done it. I mean, there are several documentaries about that. The Dutch are hopping mad. They're so hopping mad that they've stopped any kind of accession arrangements between Ukraine and the European Union in a referendum earlier this year and a petition and a vote earlier this year. So they're hopping mad that the black box, the cockpit voice recorder, the air traffic control, none of that has been released, and yet we were told at the time that no stone would be left unturned. It looks to me as if that is just basically the fascists in Kiev and the people like the Pravi sector, the far right, who had command at the time of the armed forces, shooting that airliner down, and then there's been a scrabble and an attempt to blame it on the Russians, which is absurd, or the separatists who had no such, equipment to bring down an airliner like that. So I know, wasn't what we started to talk about Iraq, but there's loads of other stuff here in the background to do with the way that the people who have attempted to actually hold the Iraq war criminals to account have themselves come under attack.
Yes, that's right. That is a very good statement. And I'm glad to hear somebody making that argument, because it was my immediate reaction too. They were punishing Malaysia. They were letting Malaysia know that if Malaysia stepped out and tried to challenge the Western supremacy, that they would be subject to any kind of attack that the governments desired. And really, if you look at the Ukrainian government and the attack there is very much an American front now. It's a puppet for the United States. Or the United States and Germany.
No, I agree. I mean, yes, I think you've got, and it's part of a kind of integration which seems to be going on between NATO and the European Union. And this is one of the reasons I'm very glad that we got a Brexit vote here a few weeks ago. Very glad to be out of it all, because the EU and NATO working together is a pretty frightening prospect. Effectively, what you've got there is you've got two superpowers, the United States of America and what's very rapidly becoming the United States of Europe, under one giant military command, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was set up after World War II, did so-called to defend us against the evil Russians, or the Soviet bloc, as it was at the time, that were intending to roll communism out right across the world, to Cuba, etc., and put Russian tanks down the Champs-Élysées and the Mall and this kind of thing. Well, of course, the complete opposite is the case. NATO have just finished their biennial summit in Warsaw. I think it was either yesterday evening or today, and NATO is running the show. NATO is in bed with all the big arms companies in the West, your Lockheeds, your EADS, your BAE Systems. They are basically inseparable, and they make the decisions about where the next war is going to be. And I think when it comes to focusing on Iraq, as we've been doing this week with Chilcot, it's really important to look back at what may have motivated that. Now, it's very difficult to, sort of get into the corridors of power and to understand why this war was cooked up basically down the pub here in London by Tony Blair, Charlie Faulkner, Lord Goldsmith, Alistair Campbell, who's Blair's spin doctor, and the cabinet secretary were having unminuted meetings, effectively completely outside the government system. And they had already decided, and as Bush has said, I will be with you, whatever. He was making absolutely no, and he says, but, there is a but that he says after that in this memo that was released by Chilcot. But that but is only, but we may have some problems with this and this and this, with some obstacles that were in the way. But Blair is saying we've got to make sure that these are all addressed now. And this is, I think that memo was early in 2003 or late in 2002. And let's not forget that there's a whole load of evidence that this was decided well before 2003, any parliamentary votes or anything like that. I mean, you can go, even if you want to, back to Richard Dearlove, who was the head of MI6, back on the 30th of November 2001. He was saying that they were going to have a regime change in Iraq, that Saddam had to be removed. He said that on the 30th of November 2001, Susan. So MI6 is running the show. Richard Pearl actually also was saying the same in 2001, effectively that we were going to invade Iraq plus. It was what Richard Pearl was saying. So there were people in the highest echelons of power, National Security Agency, these kinds of people who are pretty much the permanent government, unaccountable appointees, most of them, who had just decided for themselves, we are going to invade this country. And they were pushing ahead as a kind of spearhead where the politicians and the press were all hanging on their coattails.
Oh yes, and it was an extraordinary thing because the all of the people who had no intelligence debriefings, all of the people using their own noggins, their own brain power, their own common sense, every single one of us saw the tragedy and the stupidity and the uselessness of this wars that created nothing, no advantage for anyone. And this was the greatest show of democracy. The popular opposition to the Iraq War, the demonstrations were magnificent demonstrations of the power of democracy. If they had just listened to the people who were out marching through Europe, I think 1 of every 8 Spaniards marched and demonstrated on a single day in Barcelona, Madrid, the different cities throughout Spain. In Italy, it was the same thing. In New York, the mayor and the governor tried to shut down a major demonstration that was being timed to synchronized with London and San Francisco, and it failed. They shut down the city for 20 blocks. The streets were packed with people. It just the whole world turned out against this war.
Well, in London, in London, we had the biggest demonstration Britain has ever seen. There estimates between 1.2, some even say over 2 million people came to London to demonstrate against the war. And I mean, really, what this does prove, all of this, and particularly Chilcot this week, is that there is no democracy and there is no justice, that this is a dictatorship, that people are sitting behind the scenes. They are making the enormous decisions about where our young people are going to go and risk their lives for their own personal private profit. And please, let's not hear any more about this being a kind of dictatorship. I'll also say, just going back to 2003, anecdotally, in Bristol, Bristol's quite a big city. It's something like 600,000 people. You know, it was for a long time actually the second city, and some would say even the first city in Britain, above London in medieval times, because it's got a very nice natural port. And, you know, in those days, trading was everything by sea. And Bristol actually ran out of transport. Minibuses, no minibuses left, no coaches left. Every single one had been hired, commissioned by one group or another group, mostly Stop the War groups, sometimes trade unions, all sorts of community groups, etc., to get the population into London for the demonstration. And it was by far the biggest. It was and this is a pattern repeated in many other parts of the country, where there simply there was no transport left. Every piece of transport was taking people to London and bringing them back home that day, Susan.
Fantastic. And that is the power of the people that we have to hope is going to save us eventually. When you see the Brexit votes, it's like I won't even say the glass is half empty, half full. We are in a point of crisis. We are in a point where we must change absolutely everything that we're doing. And if we don't, we are going into a World War III scenario. And so when I see the Brexit vote, that is like a rare moment, but it's pivotal, a pivotal moment where Britain pulls its head out of its behind and says, oh God, we're not going to surrender our autonomy. We're not going to surrender our thinking and our sovereignty. And we're going to assert our own independence to save our country. I see the Brexit vote. I see these demonstrations from the anti-war period, though they fell. As soon as the war started, the United States population went back to eating its popcorn and watching the movies. It was just the stupidest people. We're such a disappointment to the planet. But now we see the massive opposition to the establishment politics. We see a fight in Bernie Sanders, which unfortunately has now capitulated, but the people are not falling into Hillary Clinton's, stupefaction as easily as the Democrats were hoping and counting on.
One thing I would say, and it's only a little brief point, is that I think we've got to be careful as individuals and as groups and as a community, really. And that is, be careful not to just curse the darkness all the time too much, because a lot of these public demonstrations, a lot of the work that I do certainly is interrogating, evidencing war crimes and that kind of thing, but I think we also got to be very, very clear about the vision of the world we do want to see. And, that enables, I think, also individuals, groups, whatever, to coalesce around a much more positive vision of the future. And I think we don't have to look back all that far in history to see where, I've done a lot of studies on the English Civil War, the Levellers and the Diggers, and these social movements, which were hundreds of years ago, Susan, at the time when people were, fed up with the Puritans in Britain and getting on ships to get across to America. But in those days, there was a really, I think, a very positive vision for a future where the earth is a free gift to mankind, and where we can share the resources, whether it's land for somewhere to live or work, whether it's the resources that come from the earth that we need to make things, etc., that there is a real commitment to sharing those resources. I mean, we're also talking about basic things like water. There's a massive struggle and battle going on in Ireland right now, which is totally unreported around the world, over the attempt to privatise the water supply over there and to start charging for the first time Irish people for water. For many years, it's been basically part of their ethos and almost written into their constitution, although not quite, that when you're paying a basic local tax, you're also getting as part of that your free water. And these sorts of inroads that the New World Order is making into the effective management of a decent society by our forefathers, people that have worked hard in the past to make sure people have got these basic essentials, they're now being taken away. So I think we've really got to stick to the Article 25, it is, in the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, about very basic access to these very basic things. And I think it's actually very simple to put the world to rights, Susan, in a way, is we've just got to kind of focus on that and not lose sight of the fact that these are free resources, free for mankind, and we've just got to make sure that everybody gets some of them. And if we start taking those rights away, anyone that does that, I think, should go to jail. This is water, food, and shelter. Anyone
and also, I would say energy.
Yeah. Well,
energy, electricity.
If you're talking about access to land, you're also talking about, maybe access to grow food, also to, to maybe some woodland, this sort of thing, for wood, for fuel. I mean, we're talking about a much more simple society in a way, but one where at least you have a choice to have a simple life. At the moment, there really is no choice to have a basic, simple life here in Britain anyway. I mean, it may be different in the US, but you cannot build anywhere. For example, if you're a homeless person and you've got building skills, you can't go and build anywhere because everywhere is privatized. The land has been privatized, enclosure. They're doing the same, incidentally, in countries like China, which, years ago have had collective land ideas, so that basically you're never going to have nowhere to live because the state will always give you somewhere and make sure you've got somewhere. They're now trying to do privatizing all the land in China to turn it into a kind of Western style capitalist. Now, to me, you've got to have some basic rights, and those basic rights are enshrined there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we don't really need to look much further than that for the vision of the future that we do want to see.
Yes, that's positive. That's a very positive vision. But at the moment, I think we have to, I think that's sort of what we see Bernie Sanders and even, I know a lot of people hate Trump, but even Trump is speaking out on these issues from the Republican viewpoint, like supporting Brexit, opposing NATO, challenging, he is running, full steam into the, against the maw of the Republicans, of the whole establishment. I won't even say, we have now realized in the United States, we recognize the Republicans and the Democrats are exactly the same. They just have different, a D or an R, it doesn't matter. Nothing, we have one leadership that is dedicated to protecting itself only and its campaign contributors, and they don't want to use the law for anyone who's not giving them money is a big part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, just getting back to Chilcot for a minute, we've also got, I think this is a really, really stark example of anyone that cares to look at all this can see there is no democracy. And when we get offered various different candidates to be prime minister or president or whatever, these are almost always in the West now part of the Bilderberg faction, I call them, which is effectively, the Bilderberg meetings I've been following for many years was set up by the CIA, CIA money anyway, and MI6 at the end of the Second World War to try and unify Europe in one political unit, which they set up through the Treaty of Rome, which was drawn up by the Bilderberg people, who started in 1954 and was chaired at the time by this ex-SS officer. But the Bilderbergs tried to bring all this together in order to really effectively carry on a kind of US. I was amazed yesterday I was in a museum down in Swindon, which is between Bristol and London. It's a kind of old railway museum because that's where they used to build all the trains, and they sent them all over the world, the locomotives. And it's a lovely museum. But one of the chaps in there, I was talking to him about Brexit, just got into the conversation, and he's one of the guides looking around the museum. Oh, he said, well, yeah, it's just a Fourth Reich now, isn't it? This is not just me saying this. There's a lot of people out there that really do believe that the EU and the setup of the European Union after the Second World War is a kind of financial empire. And in fact, if you look at some of the characters who were involved in doing deals with the Nazis, between the Nazis and the Allies towards the end of the Second World War, you can see, I mean, for example, one of them was Winston Churchill's personal assistant called Major Desmond Morton. Morton ran something called M Section at MI6, which was a kind of private army financed by King George VI. And Morton was effectively, that's exactly what he was doing. He was making deals with some of the Nazis, like Martin Bormann, who'd made so much money out of the Second World War, basically looting all of the central banks of Europe. And there was a very basic deals were done, I think, as early as the middle of 1944, or something called the Red House meeting in Strasbourg, which the Daily Mail's done very good.
Everybody,
a few years ago.
Sorry, we're coming to the break. We're coming to the break, okay. Everybody. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Covert Report with Susan Lindauer. My great guest today, Tony Gosling. We're talking about the Chilcot Report and the aftermath of the whole rise of the militarized Europe and versus the people and the European Union and the whole challenge that is going on. Europe is in turmoil right now, and it's an exciting moment. But you were talking a moment ago about finding a positive vision to work for.
Yeah, I think that's an awkward one, but I think we can broadly, with sort of libertarian right and left people, agree that everybody needs to have the basic things to survive and to live, Susan. And I think and that's one of the main things I think that the war faction wants to stop is any kind of unification between left and right around these basic ideas that everybody, I mean, the thing is, you've got a kind of landlord class, a rentier class, the French call them, who are making money from other people's poverty, effectively, through the fact that they can't afford to buy land, they can't afford to buy somewhere to live. This really does put a vast swathe of the population on the back foot. And we just need to say to those people, I'll tell you what, you can just keep your house. Nobody's going to be, I mean, this has happened in Gaddafi's Libya, by the way, that people were not allowed to have multiple homes. They had a home guaranteed, but if they tried to get somewhere else to live that was that they were then renting out to somebody else, Gaddafi saw that as wrong. Now, I mean, I'm no sort of blind fan of Gaddafi, but that was a very, very good policy. And I think we need to start looking at that kind of thing here, where, there should be limits to the amount that people can own.
In the United States right now, they're trying to throw everybody out of their houses to force people to be renters so that they will be forced to create income for corporations.
Yeah,
and
well, that's
we're in a situation now. I have the feeling that I think what you're saying is a really positive thing. I think that right now we're in the throes of revolution, aren't we? I mean, do you see that when we look back, we're going to see that we have been in a revolution and we're the first stages of revolution? Well,
I think what's happening is people are waking up, Susan. That's what's happening. I mean, we've had for many years, I mean, I've been studying this stuff for years, and it was really a video called In Plain Sight. I think that came out about 2004. I'm trying to remember. I think I'm trying to remember it was Dave von Kleist, I think it was, did that film about 9/11, and I'd been looking at Thierry Mason's work, etc., from France about critiquing 9/11, but it was really that video that woke me up. And I think we need to be making these films about all these kind of staged events that have been happening recently. Like it appears this one in Dallas the other day was staged, because we're getting very strong evidence that there were multiple shooters, and yet we're being told that there was only one shooter, and then also the police are giving us an account of what somebody who was supposed to be one of the shooters said before the police blew him up, and the press aren't even interrogating what the police are saying that he said, so we're getting hearsay presented as fact all around the world, and a lot of this really lies at the door of bad journalism. Rookie media, that is to say, people who just want to keep their job. They're not interested in telling the truth to the public that are listening. But around the idea of a more positive, and whether it's revolution or a more positive vision for the future, what's happened is pretty clear to me, is that when these wars are going on abroad, etc., there's a kind of interest by ordinary people. Obviously, we had a big demonstration in London. You've had the similar too over the Iraq war. We had a kind of, a very good critique of the intervention in Afghanistan as well here. But when things start coming to your doorstep, when suddenly you realise, well, actually, I've just been thrown out of my job, my company's been taken over, my wages have been cut in half, I'm being evicted from my home, all these kinds of things then start making people aware that there is something horribly wrong. And I think they're right. There is something horribly wrong. And that's it, that we're effectively living in a kind of soft fascist dictatorship. I mean, we were talking originally, weren't we, about Chilcot and about the Iraq war. I mean, I was talking about, MI6 and Richard Pearl knowing in 2001, saying in 2001 there was going to be an invasion of Iraq. If you roll on to 2002 at the Bilderberg conference in 2002, Jim Tucker was reporting that those were the leaks that were coming from the attendees at the Bilderberg conference in 2002, which was in Chantilly, I believe, in Virginia. Also, we had on the TV here in Britain, on the TV in Britain last week, Admiral Lord West, who was the Royal Navy's Operational Fleet Commander in 2002. And he went on to Channel 4 News last week and said, well, in 2002, I was told by one of the higher ups, he called him in big inverted commas, that we were going to have a war in early 2003 when we were going to be invading Iraq. Now, this does show you, if people care to look, that there is no democracy. And this is bound to wake people up, Susan.
Well, right now I'm looking at Hillary Clinton, and I'm looking at two major war zones that she's proclaimed directly that she wants war with these places, with Iran. I mean, Jesus Christ. She wants a war with Iran, and she also is gunning for a war with Russia.
Well, look, let me point out immediately, none of these two countries are anywhere near the United States, are they?
Oh, yeah.
This is very convenient for the Pentagon to be fighting wars on the opposite side of the world. I mean, I think that this is pretty clear. I interviewed a German guy who's a former Swiss investment banker about this whole business a few weeks ago, Manfred Petrisch. He does a German language blog, one of the best, I think, in the world. It's called All Smoke and Mirrors, Alice, Schau and Rausch. And Manfred was explaining how, look, if there is a war that breaks out, for example, with Ukraine or in Eastern Europe, Europe is going to be flattened. Most of the US nuclear weapons and US troops, he was saying that there's 70,000 US troops in Germany. It's a figure I'd not heard before. And let's remember now, of course, that many of those are now in East Germany, although when the Berlin Wall came down, there was a very solemn agreement that only German troops were going to be allowed into East Germany. Well, that's just kind of fallen by the wayside, just as have all the agreements about the number of US and NATO warships that are allowed into the Black Sea. What's happening is we are advancing without being asked, without being told, right up to the Russian border in the same way as the Russians in 1962 were advancing up to the US border in Cuba. And what they're doing, NATO and the arms people are ramping up. Now, they are trying, I think, to get a war started. There's certainly increasing tension. I noticed last week Putin up in St. Petersburg at the they have the Russians do this brilliant alternative to the Davos conference, which I would recommend anybody that's in financial circles goes to at least, if you're going to go to Davos, don't miss out on the St. Petersburg summer conference, because there Putin gave a press conference where he said, I can't understand why people aren't listening to us. I cannot understand how to get through to. I think his actual quote was, "I don't know how to get through to you." He's saying what was happening is a nuclear war is coming closer and closer by the day.
Yes.
And the reason what he's saying is the reason he's saying that he can't get through to us, and he's talking about the Western media. He's addressing it to the Western media. It's because the Western media are listening to conversations like that, and they're not reporting them. The media was a massive part of building up a case for the Iraq war back in 2003. Over in Britain here at the BBC.
Oh, it's crazy with Syria. They're doing the same thing. Iraq was, countdown to Iraq, showdown with Saddam. But then, arbitrarily, all of a sudden, Gaddafi's the bad guy that has to be removed. Really? He's only been in power 40 years. Why do we have to take him out today?
The media really is the spearhead.
Syria. Why are we doing it? There's no reason at all.
Well, I'll tell you. Okay.
No provocation, no actions. And the same thing happened with Russia. Same thing happens with Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, okay. There's two things there. Why are we doing it? Number one, I would say, have a look at 1982. It was published, and it's called the Oded Yinon Plan. He was a journalist who was attached to the Israeli military. And Yinon plan is effectively it's a very, very simple. What he's saying is, in order for the Israeli state to expand and grow, then they need to have failed states all around them. And if you have a look at that plan, effectively what they're trying to do is they're targeting many countries. Jordan is already under the spell of the Western elites, but they're particularly targeting Iraq and Syria. In that plan in 1982. You could go back even further, Susan, if you wanted to.
The Golan Heights were about to revert to Syria, and then they discovered oil.
This is
oil in the Golan Heights, and the Israelis were like, we want that oil. We're not giving it back.
You can go back even further. If you've not seen the film, I thoroughly recommend it. It's called The 3 Days of the Condor. Have you ever seen that?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's a Robert Redford film. I think it was Sidney Pollack directed it in mid-1970s sometime. And if you watch that, there's actually the hair stood up on the back of my neck when I watched it a couple of years ago, because he's talking to this senior CIA guy, even back in the 1970s. And I know it's only a feature film, but they were weaving some really fantastic truths into the films of those days. And he says, "Oh, do you have this plan to invade the Middle East?" In 1975, because that was the plan. I think back then they were weaving this stuff into. I mean, it's well worth another watch if your listeners haven't seen it.
I love 3 Days of the Condor. It reminds me of my fight against the reason for assassinating CIA people becomes so frivolous and so ridiculous and such a convoluted defense of trying to figure out why they're trying to kill you, and they're killing you because they think you know something, and you're like, what is it? I don't know what you want. What is it?
But you know that film does echo your story rather, doesn't it? Because you've got the factionalism
and the assassination, the assassin following the guy saying, but I don't even know what I know. How can you attack me for something I don't know what it is?
Yeah, and you can see the way intelligence works with factions, and you've got the good guys and the bad guys, and people who are trying to actually do the best for their country, the best for their colleagues, honest people, and then you've got people who are on the dark side who are much too close to the arms industry and that kind of thing. So it's a really brilliant. I mean, I don't think they've shown it on British television for probably about 20 years, that film, and there's good reasons why, because TV and media is the Trojan horse for all of these wars, and they're doing it still all the time, pretty much.
Now, the thing is, they're pushing hard, very, very hard for war with Russia. And I was perplexed right before our interview. There was someone, I watched a video of Farage saying that Hillary Clinton is a crook. And I love that. I love that Nick Farage saying Hillary Clinton is a crook, and I was so pleased. But the opening question that he jumped in and attacked Hillary was from the Daily Express saying, oh, what is going to happen to Britain if Donald Trump is elected and He hates NATO. He refuses to. He doesn't want to use the United States to protect the Europeans anymore. He's not going to defend us against Putin. What are we going to do? What's going to happen to all of us? Our whole society is going to collapse. Well, the way I look at it, Trump may actually save us from a World War III scenario.
He may do. We don't really need to have any kind of war with Russia. What we do need is trade and trade agreements. That's what the European. I think this is a key thing. Is that
exactly.
the Bilderberg faction, and the Pentagon and MI6 and the CIA, one of their main missions, at least the people who are running, not necessarily all the people working in these organizations. I'm talking about the apex, the sort of pyramid apex, if you want the kind of Illuminati style vision for the world, is where you drive this absolutely horrendous wedge between Germany and Russia. And that seems to have been their mission ever since the end of the Second World War, to really stop that happening. Alan Dulles being, one of the main people doing it back just after the Second World War, and also, the sort of dictator is a kind of dictatorship machine that was being begun in those days, which has become the United States of Europe, the United States of America, are both becoming dictatorships. But like I say, it's economic warfare. Effectively, the sanctions in Iraq. You're aware of all of the damage that caused to that country. There were big sanctions, of course, on Iran too. And yet Iran, many of these big nations are actually able to cope with sanctions because they've got natural resources. They can grow food. They can, build things. And what it does, in a way, the sanctions for a big country like certainly like Iran, I'm not sure what the situation was with Iraq, is it's actually made them stronger. It said, well, actually, look, as a nation, we're pulling together and we can cope. They've built some of the most fantastic architecture in the entire world in Tehran under sanctions.
Yes, indeed.
So the sanctions might be used as an economic warfare tool, but they don't actually work. And the reason I talk more about
it screws the Europeans.
This is not discussed. It's not discussed by the mainstream media at all, economic warfare, and yet it's one of the most important things that they're doing.
It is important economic warfare, and the Europeans, by cutting off their own access to markets, they have lost income and revenue for their own corporations. They've lost jobs because they're attacking Russia, they're attacking Iran, and there's no opportunities for interactions between those people. And so others do business with Iran. And it's certainly not a global it's only the Europeans and the United States who did that with Iran. Everyone else was willing to trade. And so the same with the Chinese. China has taken a very different tact of embracing cooperation, respect, mutual advantage from contracts and building trade relations. And that's one of the reasons the United States is so terrified of China going into Africa. And AFRICOM has been strengthened to stop China from going in.
Well, we've got Benjamin Netanyahu doing a trip around Africa, haven't we, this week, effectively to try to garner votes at the UN Security Council. There's two reasons for that. One, you've just mentioned, which is the strength and the trust that China now has in Africa amongst African leaders and, the sort of opinion formers and big business people right across Africa. The Chinese have shown that they're prepared to honour their word. And what the Israelis have seen is that many of these African nations are now starting to get together and vote against Israel at the UN to potentially be part of an international boycott of Israel because of the apartheid state. And so he's quite shamelessly now going around Africa right at the moment. I think he's still there, going to see all these leaders in Kenya and other places in order to try and desperately win them over with gifts of Israeli software, this is the best CCTV software. You can stop terrorism using our software. Well, of course, the Israeli way is to sell the software and then use that software and hidden backdoors in it to hack in to the governments and also to hack into the military defences of countries. So beware of Benjamin Netanyahu bearing security gifts, I say.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a long time strategy of Israel. And they've done that many times, even in the United States. They've done it to us and they've done it to our agencies as well. But the thing is, Africa does not need software the way that it needs China's bridges and dams, and China wants to build infrastructure projects for the people, like hospitals. China has labor, so China sends engineers to build projects, to build, schools, and they send teachers, and they send people to build up the human capital of the society. They have a totally different perspective that everyone should rise. I have to say there's certain things about China that I don't like at all. And then there are other things about China that I think are very admirable. And certainly the desire for everyone to rise is one of those things. I think that we're pushing Russia, the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And notice what we've done to Brazil already. The United States is certainly looking for any weak link that they can take down to challenge BRICS. But what we're doing by ostracizing Russia, we're forcing them into the arms of China and forcing them into the non-aligned states. And we're pushing that as the alternative to the West. And Europe is just bankrupt. Europe doesn't have anything to give anybody. Europe has nothing to contribute.
Let me get back to talk about a bit more about economic warfare, because I think it's so important to understand, because there's been a big attempt to mask this over the years. And obviously we've seen sanctions as a very public version of it. But if you go back to the Second World War, people like Montague Norman at the Bank of England were making secret deals with the Nazis in Switzerland because they were part of this Bank for International Settlements, which is where all the big central bankers get together, and they still do in Switzerland, in Basel. And Mark Carney, for example, the now governor of the Bank of England, is straight from there. He's from the BIS in Switzerland. But there were various characters who were seeing the Second World War as a way to make money and then to allow safe passage for Nazis after the war in exchange for getting some of that share of that money. And one of the major figures was this guy, Desmond Morton, who was Winston Churchill's personal secretary. And there is there is actually a book about him. I think it's called something along the lines of Winston Churchill's Man of Mystery. But in a way, this is a bit like the Bilderbergs. They try and cultivate this air of mystery. There is no mystery. They're just financial criminals on a massive international scale who are embedded within the government and protected by the military. There's nothing mysterious about this. This is what they are. And Morton, if you go right back with him, he was doing financial. He was the chief of financial warfare between the First World War and the Second World War in Whitehall, and then Winston Churchill moved into Chartwell, which was, if anyone ever comes to Britain and goes to see Winston Churchill's home, it's a beautiful old house in Kent, the Garden of England, and Winston Churchill actually moved to Chartwell to be near Desmond Morton. So Morton was the guy who was really in charge in many ways. I think it's pretty clear that Churchill was taking at least some of his strategic advice straight from Morton. And Morton, if you go back to the First World War, he was the aide-de-camp of General Haig, Alexander Haig, who was the maniac behind all this ridiculous trench warfare and mass slaughter of World War I. So you can trace the roots of the modern not psychological warfare, because of course that's a big thing too. That's the media's job. The financial warfare, right the way back to the slaughter 100 years ago in the Somme of World War I. There is an absolute seamless link between today and what was going on back in the trenches. The pointless slaughter of, I think it was over 1 million died in that one attack, which lasted months. And it was a completely pointless slaughter. In fact, what we're doing now is very similar. And if you were saying, well, there's no point to the Iraq thing. Well, okay, yes, I understand from a military point of view, as a soldier, many people might think that's one of the lines, but I think there is a point. It certainly benefits the Israelis. But the other thing is, we have to look at this idea of a lose scenario where the Western forces go in, and actually at the back of the mind of the really top commanders is they've no intention of winning. All they want to do is to make it a failed state, have regime change, and deny anybody the opportunity to have an independent country there, because that's where we're at now, I think, Susan, is we've got such maniacs in charge in the West that they see it as their job, even if, the country is a complete failed state and thousands of people die, that at least they can deny it to the Russians and they can deny it to the Chinese as a kind of mean superpower.
But what's beautiful about it is that those Europeans, and I know this is not beautiful. I'm being very sarcastic and scornful. Everybody understand that the consequence of all the refugees and immigrants flooding into Europe now, and the alarm that the people who are, and let's remember that the governments and the people are very different. The European peoples are the ones who are being forced to pay higher food prices, higher housing costs, higher energy costs. The European peoples are suffering because of these policies. There's no jobs. The economic warfare, cutting off ties to Iran and cutting off ties to Russia, has pushed up utility costs for living and has deprived of global markets that would create income manufacturing jobs. So the ordinary people in Europe are suffering because of the elite policies. But also now the beauty of the quote beauty of it is that now the immigration, the refugees are flooding in, fighting to get away from the wars, and the European governments are being destabilized that way.
Well, it's certainly true what you're saying. I just think that it's important to acknowledge that there is a lot of information out there, particularly online, which helps us to understand what's going on. We're being flooded, I think, particularly by broadcast media nonsense. And, most young people now don't bother with it. They get most of their news on social media through Twitter, Facebook and things like this. But I'd just like to acknowledge the work done by Bill Cooper back in the 1990s. He was a US talk show host over in Arizona, a place called Eager, Arizona, doing shortwave broadcasts and FM broadcasts locally right across the states and to some